Hi, welcome everybody. Nice to see you. We're in quarantine and the lawn guys are here because we are on Long Island. So I'll try to talk above them and hope that they leave us soon. Well, it's nice. Thank you all for coming. This is great to get together and share a little bit of history and culture. It's great that you all took the time. I've been teaching in Hofstra for about 20 years. And I've taken students to Ireland about 10 years in a row. I teach a lot of the courses in our Irish Studies department. One of the things, has anybody been to Ireland or have any background in Irish lit and history? You been, Tom?
Loved it. Favorite country.
Where did you go?
We toured from Dublin all the way to the west.
Nice.
We had a chance, of course, to see, because I'm sort of crazy about Neolithic monuments. We saw New Grange and a few others, which were absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. Very nice. You saw a lot. Very nice. And so what you know about the Irish is they all know their own history. Everyone, right? Every cab driver, bus driver, lay person, people you meet on the street, they all know their own history. It's a frame of reference for everyone, and they love to talk to us about politics and history. And I'm often embarrassed because we don't walk around with that same kind of everyman knowledge of who we are and where we come from. One of the reasons, and I've just found this through my own research, putting classes together, one of the reasons is because so much of the history and the culture is carried in culture. Carried in theater, carried in poetry, carried in song. And so much of what has happened, so much of political, social change and political discourse has taken place in theaters and pubs and the kinds of conversations you have when you visit. The stories are carried from generation to generation. And the history of the Irish, of course, is that it was England's Ireland until 1946. So in England's Ireland, people had very few rights. And so they could have the conversations about what it is to be a citizen, what it is to be a sovereign nation, what it is to participate in governance in these artistic venues. I will direct you to my screen.
Who's got the radio on? Please turn it off.
That's me, I'm sorry. I don't even hear it.
Hold on.
Are you getting the screen share on your thing?
Yeah, but my document's not popping up. Let's see. Caroline?
Yeah. What's going on, Patricia? What do you need?
I want to see if my daughter can help me. I can't get the PowerPoint.
Oh, Caroline, help.
When you hit screen share, it should give you an option for files. You know, what do you want to share? And it should say something about files, but if she can do it, it would be much easier. Whose pup is that? Is that the
I'll give you one guess.
Well, listen, it could be when my cat starts screaming, you'll hear that too.
Come here. It's only the mailman.
And remember, this is all going to be going up on our website, so don't say anything that you're going to be embarrassed to have heard by the immediate world. Just so you know.
I'm glad you said that, Ellen.
Don't even talk, please. I'm busy.
You know, we are going to, and I don't have editing capabilities.
Oh, I got it.
Here we are.
Okay, so there we are. No, that's not what you want, Patricia. You want your file. Yeah, that's what you want. There you go. And bring that to the front. You want to minimize your other thing.
Oh.
Yeah, get that. There you go.
There you go.
There we go.
This is a first for all of us. We're going to do fine.
Okay, we good?
Yes.
Yes,
Thank
yeah.
you for your patience. Okay.
This is good. Yes, hopefully I do something.
So, Irish independence and public discourse. The talk, the music, the culture carried the story, the storytelling, the collective purpose for why people sought an independent nation.
Please.
And here, this is what is called the GPO, the General Public Office in Dublin. And this was the place that the proclamation, I'm going to start talking about the proclamation for public, for Irish independence, and then work backwards and talk about how it was built over 200 years in these various discourses. So it was read on April 24th, 1916, in front of this building by Patrick Pierce. People woke up that morning. It was the end of 6 days of rebellion. They woke up to posters posted all over Dublin, and it was only about 6 paragraphs, and it was read right here. It was just 6 paragraphs, and one of the interesting things about this rebellion was that it was largely unplanned. It was only about 25 guys. If anybody's seen the movie Michael Collins, except Liam Neeson's about 45 when he's playing the part, but they were only about 25 years old, and there were only about 25 of them, and they were a motley crew, which is exactly what Yeats calls them in the commemorative poem, which we'll talk about in a little while. They didn't have any uniforms. They had a lot of failed plans. They'd gone to France to see if they could get help. Germany was supposed to send them some arms, but that didn't fall through. It fell through rather, but they ended up jumped over some boat in the Atlantic. And so last minute, the messages got mixed up, and these guys began this rebellion. They knew they would lose, but they began it because it was part of this extended public theater, this extended discourse that it was time for this proclamation, mostly because they were left behind in Dublin because of World War I. They were afraid of conscription, because this is England's Ireland. They didn't want to go and fight for Germany, fight for England rather. And because there was no economic promise for them, if there was no war, they would have gone to England or the United States, but the borders were closed. And so these guys were stuck in Dublin. And this was the result of all of these years of protests. So at the end of this very messy, very unplanned 6 days, and right before they were executed, this proclamation is read. One of the notable things about the proclamation is that it includes the right for women to vote. So while it seems very old-fashioned in some ways, it was progressive in others. I'm sorry. Oh, and also Ellen and I discussed that we want to keep keep you unmuted, because it's fun for you to ask questions as we go instead of trying to remember stuff at the end. So please feel free to pipe in if you have anything to add or any questions. And you'll note it even begins with Irish men and Irish women, that the Irish were always progressive in this way. I've taken the liberty to highlight stuff that looks very much like our own declaration. Ireland had been in the War of Independence before this, along with France, very inspired by the American Revolution. And you can hear Thomas Jefferson in a lot of the phrasing of this proclamation. He talks about Ireland being supported by her exiled children in America by gallant allies in Europe, but relying first on her own strength. So, about her exiled children, when they talk about her exiled children, they're talking about the Irish in diaspora. Diaspora spread, like Jewish culture and African culture, spread right spread around the world. And so her exiled children and her allies in Europe, which is also a veiled threat, that they could go and fight in Europe, but they've chosen to stay here instead. And then this language also.
Yeah, man, but I can't.
Okay, I hear you.
Can I stop for a second and see how you guys are doing? Can you
Something
hear me?
Somebody's having trouble.
moving around quite a bit and making a lot of noise.
No, I don't think the volume's off on my
Could you
on
please
my computer.
turn off your mic? And whoever's phone is ringing, could you please turn off your mic so that it doesn't disturb everybody? A little bit in fact, if you would mute yourselves and only unmute when you have a question, that would eliminate the need and all that background noise. It's making it very difficult for everybody to hear. So please try to be considerate of your fellow listeners.
Okay, one thing we could do, this is funny. Okay, one thing we could do is, we could mute you, right? And then there's a function where you could raise your hand electronically. And if Ellen, you want to give me a shout if you see a hand raised, then I could stop and we could unmute that person. Does that help?
I can't necessarily see everybody at the same time to see hands, but there is a chat box. Does anyone know where the chat box is?
No.
Oh,
Or you could physically raise your hand like this.
Can you see it?
But
I can only see a couple of you.
yeah, we can't see everybody. That's the problem. Even once the screen is shared, we can't see everybody, even if we expand it. You know, I can only see a few people at a time. So I wouldn't necessarily, but what you might be able to do is just make a note of your question. And then afterwards, I mean, if you know you're making noise and wiggling around, just mute your mic. I mean, that's just really the best thing to do.
Okay. Okay, do you want me to start again?
I think you can pick up, go back one frame.
Left off.
Okay, so you've heard about the Easter Rising, perhaps, if you've seen the Liam Neeson movie, Michael Collins. It's about the Easter Rising. And the Easter Rising was the beginning of Irish independence and the end of a long story of layers and layers of what we call public discourse, public speakers, civil acts of civil disobedience, poetry, theater, music, all contributing to this national conversation for people who didn't have a voice, people who didn't have a vote, were not allowed to participate in government. So little wonder that the Irish not only mastered the colonial language, but they took to the arts so they could, as the ancient Greeks did, gather and talk about what it meant to be human, what it meant to be a son or a daughter, what it meant to be a sovereign nation, what it meant to have some of the freedoms we take for granted, such as freedom of speech. And you'll see that these kinds of values are reflected in this proclamation. And I've taken the liberty to highlight just some of the elements of it that look very much like our Declaration of Independence. So for example, this phrase, supported by her exiled children in America and by gallant allies in Europe, but relying in first on her own strength, being self-supportive, her exiled children, referring to diaspora, her people who are scattered, as were the Jews, as were Africans. The Irish also had diaspora scattered into the air. And so her exiled children. And so the audience for this proclamation, much like the Declaration of Independence, is the rest of the world. It's not just Dublin. And she's calling upon her exiled children in America for international support as well. And she certainly got it. And by Europe, as she had in the past, especially during the famine, when the continent, when the English in particular realized what was happening to the Irish, the English citizens realized what the government had done to the Irish, especially in the West, in the famine. People began to get relief. Things began to change. So they called upon, outside of their isolation, called upon the continent and the United States to listen to them, and called upon those alliances. We declare the right of the people, this language that's taken right from our declaration, to be sovereign. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government, taken right from Jefferson. The idea of successive generations, something that they're crafting, that they're establishing for successive generations, have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty, and asserted it in arms. This is something that's militaristic about this, as there is about our declaration. We pledge our lives in the face of the world, fundamental right, the positive freedom for all Jeffersonians. Right down to resolve the pursuit of happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and all of its parts. This becomes significant later on because, as you know, there was the division. There's a division, right? There were 26 counties delivered into what would become a republic, and 6 counties until today are still part of the UK. But this proclamation called for all of its parts, cherishing all of the children of a nation equally, and oblivious to the differences carefully fostered by an alien government, which have divided a minority from the majority. And at the end, there's even a cult to God, Most High God, and the destiny to which it is called. So there's some sense of unity between Catholic and Protestant. When we talk about Irish unity and Irish politics, and we make designations of Catholic and Irish, those aren't religious designations necessarily. It's more about heritage and identity, how people identify, and sometimes, but not always, where their political allegiances are. And interestingly enough, most of the people who were responsible for Irish sovereignty were Irish Protestants from Dublin. They were empowered. This is a little bit of an echo, I'm sorry. They had the power to do so, and they recognized that they had some moral obligation to stand up for their persecuted brothers and sisters, not just to include Catholics, but also Presbyterians were prosecuted and were punished under the penal laws. So this is what that poster looked like. That was all over a very smoky and distraught Dublin on the morning of April 26th.
Can you restrain the noise?
I'm sorry?
Not you, hon.
Okay.
In my background.
I think we're okay. This is going to be a little folksy because we're all home, right? Okay.
Control the native.
So these are the penal laws that were put into effect, and they weren't lifted until 1920. So even when this document was created, these laws, although they may not have been enforced as strictly as they were in the 16 and 1700s, they were still on the books. There were many more than this, but just off the top, Irish Catholics couldn't exercise religion. They couldn't receive an education, enter a profession, hold public office, engage in trade. They couldn't live in a corporate town. They couldn't own horses. They couldn't purchase lard. They couldn't own land. They couldn't lease land. They could purchase lard. They couldn't lease land. They couldn't vote. They couldn't carry arms. They couldn't attend mass. They couldn't worship. And they were being conscribed to join the Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church. This also included Presbyterians. They couldn't educate themselves or their children, and it was against the law to speak or write in the Irish language. And this goes back to the Tudor times. When we think about the Tudors, right, we think about jolly old England and the bubonic plague and Shakespeare, and if the world was about empire right back then. And England was in the center of the empire, London was in the center of England, and Shakespeare was in the center of London. And we think about it in such romantic terms, Not so much for the Irish people, though. During those times, it was all about assimilation, and children had to learn to speak in the English language, and were punished. Like in so many other stories of colonialism in Africa, in particular, if people spoke their native language, the children got punished. So this is the background. These are hundreds and hundreds of years of Irish Irish subjugation to British law. And there are many more, as you can see. Education would be most important. Is there a question? Well, so one of the results of this was that there were two kinds of schools. There was the national school. The national school was the official school that was run by the British government, but Irish Catholics could not attend. They had Protestantism to attend those schools. If what they did instead was they created something called a hedge school. A hedge school. You know, there's an echo. Let me see if I can.
Do you have your cell phone on?
I'm going to move. I have another device here. Yeah. Hold on.
Yeah, that's what's doing it.
Okay, the hedge school is literally to be held next to a hedge. So if people were found studying, they could scatter. And so that's what they became. They worshipped outside them. It was called a mass rock for the same reasons they could scatter quickly. So the result of this, again, the beginning of public discourse, was to study Greek, to study Latin, to study languages, to study about the world in places where maybe you only knew 50 people your whole life. But they began to study as a way of pushing back on the penal code. Robert Emmet. There are a couple of speeches by the doc, but this is the most famous one. He was born to a prosperous Protestant family in Dublin. He went to Trinity College. He got kicked out. And because of his political activism in support of the Irish, I'm sorry. And he became the secretary of the United Irish Committee, which then he was kicked out of Trinity College in April 1798. Catholics and Presbyterians were not allowed to attend Trinity College, and women not until much later. And he began to go and ask Napoleon for some help in mounting an Irish rebellion. Napoleon, as usual, was a no-show. He was always threatening to show up, but he never did. And meanwhile, Emmet had organized these safe houses for arms and explosives. Well, there was an accident and one of the houses exploded, so he was found out, and they had to launch into a rebellion that was also unplanned and was doomed to fail. And Emmet was marked for execution for treason because he was a Protestant and was consorting with Catholics to overthrow the government. So he was found guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And in the long history of Irish rebellion, he took the moment. And this also would remind you of what Martin Luther King did, right? When he went to jail, it was a political act. He didn't leave unprepared. He went with his library and his attorney, and he took that platform to speak to the world about the famous letter from Birmingham jail. And this is exactly, this was in the tradition of people such as Robert Emmet. These were his last words as he's being hung. He says, "I'm going to my cold and silent grave." It was a very long speech. "My lamp of life is nearly extinguished. My race is run. The grave opens to receive me, and I sink into its bosom. I have but one request to ask at my departure from this world. It is the charity of its silence. Let no man write my epitaph, for is no man who knows my motives dare now vindicate them. Let not prejudice or ignorance asperse them. Let them and me repose in obscurity and peace, and my tomb remain uninscribed.
Come on.
Times. Everything okay? When my country takes her place among the nations of the earth, and then, not till then, let my epitaph be written. I am done." So he says, look, you can shoot me, you can hang me, you can quarter me, but do not put my name on my grave until Ireland is a nation. And and those words and a reference to this actually go into the final document that was drafted in 1946. We think that he was buried under St. Peter's Church. His family would not have let his grave go unnoticed or unmarked, but it certainly was not public. About the same time, also in Dublin, is the Irish Literary Revival. Let's go ahead of myself a little bit. This is the kind of, we've seen these simian images of people before, notably in Europe, before the European Holocaust, and notably in the American South. These simian images, it's very easy to justify, the results of colonialism when you dehumanize people. So this was the propaganda in the British press. It's much more like it. It's kind of more than we want to contemplate on, but that is a fact. And so the Irish Literary Revival was created by Yeats and Lady Gregory and William Synge, among others, to elevate. And these were also part of the Protestant hierarchy. Right? These are the people who ran Dublin, but they had a noblesse oblige. They knew that they should do better because they were in a position to do so. And so they began this Irish Literary Revival to undermine images such as the one I just showed you. And they instead sought to recapture this identity of the Irish peasant as somebody who was spiritual and separate and wasn't just a person without agency, that had a body of the mind and the spirit as well, rather than just a peasant with the life of only with their lives in their bodies. And so they sought to elevate this sort of identity, this sort of self-image of the and to restore something that was stolen as well, which is their Druid roots, which never entirely went away with their conversion to Catholicism, and that's a whole other class. But to honor the idea of the supernatural, the pastoral, the magic of what happens in the pastoral life. So they established in the Abbey Theatre a kind of theater that would elevate the Irish and the dignity of the Irish, I guess I should say. And here was the names of the first playwrights, Thomas MacDonagh among them, who was executed in the Easter Rising. This is right in the center of town. There were riots when The Plough and the Stars and when Playboy of the Western World were first staged. There were riots in the streets. The most surprising part, after you look at these beautiful images of the theater in Dublin, is the modesty with which this began. Synge was he was attending the Sorbonne in Paris, and Yeats visited him and said, you're getting too continental. You're an Irishman. Why are you trying to be anything except who you are? And Synge's response was, well, we're part of the Protestant ascendancy, and I don't really know what that is. And so Yeats told him to go to a place, give up Paris. He says, go to the Aran Islands and live there as if you were one of the people themselves. Express a life that has never found expression. And that's exactly what Synge did. He lived in the Aran Islands in the summers for several years, and he moved among its people and photographed them. These are his photographs. And he recorded the music of their language and studied their culture and presented it as this sort of what is purely Irish. Now the Aran Islands, I've been to any island off Ireland is called an Aran Island, but the three famous ones, the ones about which he wrote, are off the coast of Galway. Maybe Tom, you've been there, I don't know. I've been to all three, and the one where he lived and stayed, Inishmaan, is the most desolate. as you can see in this photograph, it's all limestone. It's like a microwave in the summer because you have the heat from the ocean and you have the sun above you and coming up from the limestone, and there's no cover. It's really brutal. This is a picture of the house in which he lived for many years, and Beckett visited there, and Lady Gregory and Yeats. And this little cottage was the real home of the Irish literary revival. What we saw all gussied up in Dublin was that, after the dress rehearsal, but it all began here, all the discussion about what was important to them and finding this life which has never found expression. Riders to the Sea is also a very, very famous play that came out of this period. People lived by the sea, they died by the sea. Women typically had 6 to 12 children. She would lose half of them before they were 25, mostly to the sea. And there was a lot of superstition surrounding how people fish, how people are buried. It's a brutal life. People who lived there had to be able to do everything, including, make shoes out of calf skin, make a cradle. One of the ironies is that people were always in the business of building cradles and building coffins. Life was very, very short there. This is a picture, a painting of Riders to the Sea, of the kind of boats that people inhabited. And this is the outside of the cottage. I was lucky enough to visit there. There's a lady there. It's funny. It's not run by any government. The house is just there. It belongs to the great granddaughter of its original owner. Her name is Mary Singh, and she will collect like €5 and sit and give you a whole talk about what happened in those 2 rooms. And one of the things that is notable is that the rich spoken language of the Irish peasant characters dominated his more mature works. And it was by him spending time there and listening to people instead of being told by the British press who these people were. Now, one of the most famous storytelling of Irish independence is from the Yeats poem, Easter 1916. Does anybody know it?
No.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna read through it with you. Liam Neeson, after you're finished with this, if you're interested, you can go on YouTube and just type in Liam Neeson. He does a beautiful job reading it to you. But I'm gonna do it instead of Liam, so you could stop and ask me questions, and I could stop and give you some commentary. But this is the way history was recorded. We only have Irish studies in the past 2 decades or so because it just wasn't but the American Academy didn't consider it worthy of academic study. And in fact, it and American studies were pretty new. And imagine the ludicrousy of in the English department of teaching Irish studies, that you've colonized our language and now you're colonizing everything we produce in the colonial language through many generations. And so to take a look at Irish studies and American studies and Africans, all the studies, to take a look at them through the context of their own history is something that's very new in academia, and a lot of fun, because since it's new, it's up to all of us to import the cultural artifacts that we're just learning about and the connections we're just learning about, historical connections, and make meaning of them. So I like this also because it reminds us that these were young people. He says, I have met them at the close of day, coming with vivid faces, from counter or desk among great 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. The picture to the right is Miriam Street, which is where Yeats lived, and was much like any other street in Dublin. It was city life. These are young people, and you could see that this is people coming and going, that there was a history that Joyce wrote about, the flaneur, the person who walks around town and makes observations, talks to everybody. And so his young city life, people are exchanging funny stories and a fire at the club. And he talks about liver motley is worn. Motley would mean colorful clothing, costumes, theater, possibly, but when one wears in the city, and then all of a sudden everything goes from this to something very different. A terrible beauty is born. Terrible meaning the violence, the pain, the suffering, and the beauty not only of the country, but of a sense of what sovereignty could look like. Now this is funny because this gets a little gossipy. First he mentions people in generality and he focuses down. This poem is in 4 stanzas. Some people think this was to symbolize the 4th month, April, when when this proclamation is achieved. He says that woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill. That would be right next to that stanza is Constance Markowitz. Her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful? She rode to harriers. That man, this guy right next to her, that would be Patrick Pierce, had kept his school. He taught the Irish language and rode our winged horse. That this other helper, this would be Thomas MacDonagh, who was a very good poet, and friend, was coming into his force. But that he means he's about to be executed. He was just coming into his force, his own power as a young writer and maybe an activist, but no more. He might have won fame in the end. So sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken and vainglorious lout. That's this guy in the bottom who was his romantic rival for a beautiful actress named Maud Gunn, who Yeats was in love with, but McBride married. So to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. Casual comedy would be everyday life in Dublin, right? He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. So, okay, the youth of that first picture is all gone now. Hearts with one purpose alone, and this would be 1916, this would be during the Rising. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble the living stream, the horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud. Okay, so this reference to stone, a stone to trouble the living stream. So a stone is anchored, right? The stone is steady, it's still. It doesn't move. Likening itself to Ireland, and it's the stoniness of Ireland, right? It's all on limestone. So a stone. So the stream is changing. Nature is changing. Summer and winter come and go. The stream changes, but the stone is the same. The stone is this one purpose alone. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud. Minute by minute, they change. Everything is in flux. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. So again, above the stream, the shadows of the cloud, a horse hoof slides on the brim, and the horse splashes within it. A long-legged moor's hen dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute, they live. The stones in the midst of it all. So nature is coming and going. There's horses and moor hens, and birds and shadows, and everything is changing. But the stone, this rock, remains the same in the middle of it all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? So he's got some doubt here because they're young, and he's written this to commemorate it, right? He doesn't know the result yet. To murmur name upon name as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that have run wild. These young people were all executed. As you can see, Countess Moritz was put in prison, but the rest were executed in the morning. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith that for all that is done and said, we know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. But what if excess of love bewildered them? They died. I write it out in verse, McDonough and McBride, and Conley and Pierce. Now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Significant to note that one of the restrictions in the penal code was people couldn't wear green, which is why people go so crazy, dyeing their hair and dyeing the River Shannon, or the river in Chicago, and also in Savannah, Georgia, right?
I think in Boston they do it too.
In Boston they do it too, but that's why, because the Irish couldn't wear green. And so he says their names. And so commemorating these dead by name is also a way of it's the epitaph, right? It's the thing that Emmett spoke about. It assigns it purpose and meaning and even beauty, and leaves the story behind for others. Well, this is a poem by Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney was from the north, from just outside of Belfast. The story about Seamus Heaney is that had he been born 20 miles to the south, we would never have heard of him. But he went to the good British schools. He was technically a British citizen. And he also, like Yeats, was ambivalent about taking political sides. Sometimes, like Yeats kind of sort of does here, he assigns a resonance and a beauty and a question without making a political statement. And Heaney does much of the same because he sees his role as an intermediary. He sees his role as a peacemaker, and he's very concerned about the peace process because the history is such that that's the only resolution, right? That's the only resolution. It's complicated. It's a very long history, and I've got stacks of textbooks about it. It's tribal, and so finding a empathy, a radical kind of empathy, is the path a lot of Irish writers and a lot of Irish American writers have taken. So the Curatory is also from a play. It's the chorus of a play. And I'll go stanza by stanza through this as well, if you will indulge me. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. So he begins by establishing that we're imperfect. We hurt each other. We're reading a poem, and yet he's saying that a poem or a play or a song can't fully right the wrong. But he's writing the poem, so he's going to give it a terror of language, inflicted and endured. And he offers both elements of this, wrong inflicted as well as a wrong endured. He's going to look at all sides of it. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. This is a direct reference, of course, to the Troubles in the North, and written about and around that time. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. This could be a reference to Longcash, to the hunger strikes. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. So at this point, obviously, a father has lost his son, right? He stands in the graveyard, he's speechless. A police widow in veils. If there's a police widow in this scenario, that would be somebody on the loyalist side, right? On the English side. A police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. So he's surveying the suffering on both sides of this conflict, right? That people are losing their husbands and their children. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. Then once in a lifetime, a long-forward tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. This is an interesting stanza because it does a couple of things, right? It personifies history. The history speaks to us. And history says, and this is very common in Christian ideology, don't hope on this side of the grave, that we pray for grace in the afterlife, right? We do good in this life and hope that we are rewarded for it in the next. And so he says, history says that. But then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up. So you say, okay, just take a break from, or step aside from and try this one. And of course, this is almost like the ark, a longed for a tidal wave, and the tidal wave is a metaphor for justice, can rise up. It's also this is a Christian reference to baptism, to cleansing, right? Can rise up, and hope and history rhyme, which of course doesn't make any logical sense. Hope and history literally can't sound the same, and yet there could be a change in logic, a change in our perception in which hope and history can rhyme. So hope for a great sea change. I love all these nautical references. A great sea change on the far side of revenge. A sea change, literally, if anybody's spent any time watching the East River, literally and it happens in the Hudson River sometimes, where the tide changes and goes in a different direction. Hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Those are direct references to the ancient Druid religions of Ireland. And there are still healing wells in almost every town, every small town in Ireland. So I'll call miracles self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. This poem is full of double takes as well, right? So there's this fire and there's water. If there's fire on the mountain, or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and birth cry of new life at its term. So there's fire on the mountain and lightning. This is apocalyptic, right? And lightning and storm. This reminds me of Moses, right? The burning bush. And a God, small case, a God speaks from the sky. This is deliberately not speaking from any particular religious tradition, but acknowledging the commonality between religious tradition. That someone, again, also no direct reference to a creator, but someone is hearing the outcry and birth cry of new life. This reminds me of Lion King, right? They hold up the lion. But at the end of this poem, where in the beginning a father loses his son, at the end somebody becomes a parent. Right? And so there's this sense of cyclicality. And the poem is almost, you can almost fold it in half, and at the end, I'm sorry. At the end, the stanzas break and it's a shorter stanza. So let me just stop for a second and see if there's any questions. Anybody have any comments?
I'm seeing a whole new side to this poetry. I appreciate the explanations and the connections.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's fun to slow it down, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, translations. This is a fun story. What I love about theater is there's just so many great stories. This is another story of carrying the story of independence forward, but more importantly, an independence that's that shares governance, that works for everybody, that assures, as the proclamation says, ensuing generations, right? And we'll talk about Brexit for a few minutes at the end of this, but this is an ongoing conversation. Translations was produced in 1980 in Derry. Derry is a divided town, literally. It's a medieval town right on the cusp of County Donegal. And it's got two names, it's Derry or it's Londonderry. Has anybody seen Derry Girls on Netflix? Watch it. If you haven't watched it, watch it tonight. It is the funniest thing in the world. I can't wait for the new season. But it was in the heart of the Troubles, and most of you would know what the Troubles were. It was in the heart of the Troubles, and the play itself is, it's about language, and it's about the young cartographers who come from England to the north of Ireland, and they change all the signs and they anglicize the signs. So the one they use, it's a fictitious name. They call it Ballybeg. And if you've been to Ireland, it's an accomplishment now. The names have been restored. They're in the English language and also in the Irish language. But this commemorates when they first came over and went town by town and renamed everything. And when the play begins, the entire stage floor is a blank map of Ireland. And when it's finished, all the new names are chalked in. On the stage, because it takes place in a hedge school, earlier I spoke to you about a hedge school, people would gather around a hedge and they would learn Latin and Greek and ancient languages and read ancient literature, then they would disperse. So this is what was depicted on the stage, people in a hedge school. And there are all of these languages, and the reason for this is it was like Babylonian, people speaking past each other. But when these young guys arrive from England and they come into the hedge school and they say, well, where is Ballybeg? And where is Mallinbeg? And you can see that they're just kids. They have a government job. They don't know what they're doing. They're doing the business of the government, but they're not part of the decision-making process. And so they all get to know each other. One guy stays behind and falls in love with an Irish girl and stays there. Most of you, I think, are old enough to remember the show F Troop. This is kind of what happens. They're just kids. It's kind of goofy. But what happened as this play is rendered, it retraces how England occupied Ireland. And it wasn't entirely militaristic. It was in this kind of a way. These human beings being sent over to do this kind of work with which they had no connection. And it's really hard to hate the characters on stage. And so the accomplishment of the play, that it addresses systems of duplication and replication of distrust and hatred in the very place in which hatred is being duplicated and replicated. In Guildhall, which was a unionist stronghold, it was the city hall in the middle of Derry/Londonderry. And the night of the first performance, the mayor stood up with a standing ovation and joined them. He thought it was wonderful because it was teaching people, this is the same thing that you're remembering and being told through the generations, the hate and the sectarian violence. It began with these kids being sent to do a job. And, it took it really down to size. It humanized the British people in a way that hadn't been done in Northern Ireland before. When I teach Irish studies too, I'm always careful to remind students that British people weren't taught Irish history. They didn't know about the penal code. They knew very little about the famine. It wasn't in the books. So when these things were carried out by the government, it's really important to not engage in some idea that it was one people versus another. It wasn't. It was a small amount of people in government. So anyway, Derry was also, it was a suitable place to open this play because it was a place that was concerned with place names. It had two names, depending upon if you were Irish or Protestant, depending upon if you lived in the projects or you lived up on the hill. You called it two different things. But the best part of it was that the second night, after this first uproarious night, people are screaming, and the British were so upset that they sent in helicopters and they had them hovering around the second floor of the theater, hovering around the theater so people couldn't hear the players speak. They were so threatened by this. And if you have a chance to open it's very dense. It takes a lot of time to get through it all. But just to take a glance at it, it's very cute. And there's nothing that's radical about this play except for its empathy. Yeah, and then of course the audience response to it. So yeah, so that they had these choppers hovering around because this is how these artists, through the British government off balance. And upon exiting the theater, Seamus Heaney was heard to have said, "No, this is what theater was supposed to do." And that's a picture of that's the actual production. Okay, do you guys know anything about the Fields of Athenry? When I played for you, you might know the music. Let me show you the words. This is what the Fields of Athenry look like. It was written by an American. They're pretty unremarkable. It's just a bunch of fields between Galway and Dublin. You can see it on the train. It's only a 2-hour train ride from one side of the country. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny. These are the words. I'll read the words first. By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling, "Michael, they have taken you away." This is about the famine. For you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young men see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. So this man is stealing corn for his family to eat, and he's arrested and taken away, never to see his family. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where we once watched small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. You can hear this sort of this longing that you hear in Yeats's poem as well. For a youth that is cut short by a lonely prison wall, I heard a young man calling, "Nothing matters, Mary, when you're free. Against the famine and the crown, I rebelled, they cut me down. Now you must raise our child with dignity." Let me play you. This is fun.
With this.
You know the song?
I've heard, I think the Irish tenors sing it. I think it's on one of their CDs. The words just look so familiar.
That's right. Okay, so you'll know this one, Ellen.
Maybe.
This one's like a ballad.
Yeah. Ellen is the most Irish one among us.
She's got an Irish name.
Yeah, there we go.
Hello. How are you? I'm good. How are you?
That's it.
That wasn't it?
I know it said that on the bottom.
British guy.
It said
He looked so Irish.
right? We love technology.
By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling, "Michael, they have taken you away. For you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. Low lie the fields that run, where once watched the small river fly. Our love on the wing, round the fields that fly. By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young man calling, "Nothing matters, Mary, when you're free. against the famine and the crowd. I leave them down. Now you must raise our child.
Okay. So that's a song most people know. Now, there's been some controversy about this song. Sometimes it's been called a rebel song. This is by a young London trio. What's interesting is context is everything, depending upon how you tell the story.
All the Irish music is so sad.
It is sad.
It's just sad.
Now you see, I said, the British kids didn't grow up learning about this stuff, but the music carries the message. What do you guys think of this? Does the story change for you at all?
Doesn't sound quite as depressing when they're singing.
Yeah, I mean, they're celebrating this guy. It's like, hey, you stole the corn, right? This one. Okay. This is from a Serbian group called the Orthodox Celts. And what I admire about this recording, it reminds me of a Heaney's poem. The lyrics are universal enough that we can take these circumstances and take this language and further understand our own situations, right? So my dog agrees. Isn't that crazy?
I can't even understand it.
I like the audience with the things and the
Yeah,
bands. They're into it.
Serbia.
Is this the way they're performing it, or is this just a bad video?
Oh, it's just a bad video.
Okay.
It's Serbia. But it's interesting is that these are people who know a lot about losing a home, right? They know a lot about diaspora. And they're young. They're young. That's, you know, and this song is fairly old. It was written in the 70s.
I was written in the 50s. Wait a minute.
And this is why this song is called the unofficial national anthem. It was written by an American, but it's
Yeah.
great. So this has become a tradition in Irish soccer. That the way that they cheer their team on is they spontaneously, this is not part of a ceremony, they spontaneously burst into this song.
The Irish do love their music.
And their beer.
I wish I had right now.
But they all sing.
Yep.
Everyone sings.
Mm-hmm. And that's the way the Irish entertain, not just in pubs, but even in their homes.
Yeah.
Everybody takes a turn singing or telling a story or reciting a story.
Stories, yeah. A lot of storytelling.
My wife is Irish. And she can't sing.
But she probably does it anyway.
She does anyway, right?
Well, I really wouldn't call that singing, though.
You don't get to call it, though.
You know who the boss is in my house.
Well,
Not you.
It never was.
Okay. So, talk to me. What'd you think? What'd you learn? Have any questions? And this is a
No.
brief overview. There's a lot, right? We can talk about the whole of Irish history and performativity.
One of the things that surprises me is most of this happened within the last, 100, 150 years. I thought that the struggle for Irish independence went, back centuries.
Oh, it did. I'm not a historian. I'm a literature and writing professor. No, it did, but we don't have it recorded. What we have recorded, the way this story has been carried. I mean, all those different speeches at the dock. When people get executed, they give a speech first. It's like, okay, that's fine. You can do this, but I'm going to take this moment in history and make it a political moment. So it's captured for all, but there's no recording. So there's very little that's in terms of scholarship that's written pre-famine anyway. I mean, there's a lot for you and me, but in terms of like what kind of research you see for other kinds of history, it's more extensive. But yeah, that's a great observation. And of course, she's only been a nation officially since 1946, and the proclamation was 1916. So it's not a very long time at all.
What does the Irish saying on the screen translate to?
Oh, it says many thanks.
There's many things?
Many thanks.
Many thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
Mila.
Mike, to your point, when I was touring around Ireland, the history is unbelievable when you're talking about historically things were built thousands and thousands of years ago. I mean, some of their places of worship or whatever were from 5,000 plus years ago. The Hill of Tara, for one, was interesting, and things like that. But what I found was that the people were very open and very easy to talk to. And I asked one question. I said, how come on all these old structures I don't see any roofs. Did they cave in? Were they made of wood?
Thatch.
You know, and I was told that no, whenever we left a place, we ripped down the roof because the British would tax us on the roofs.
Oh.
So that's why they ripped them down. And they also said that's why you see a lot of Irish architecture with small windows, because they literally measured the window to tell them what tax they would pay by the size of the window also.
Yeah,
So
I remember seeing that on an Irish census, and when they talked about the buildings, and they rated it in terms of the number of windows. Yes.
yeah, it was fascinating, but when you start talking to the locals, you know, about that and the history and how far back it goes.
Yeah, I think that's incredible, because I always thought because it was cold and it was difficult to heat a building, that's why they had the small windows to prevent heat loss. Big windows, you got a tremendous amount of heat leaving the structure.
Makes sense.
So I just assumed it was because of thermal conditions
Yeah.
that they had small windows.
Well, some combination. I mean, those thatch cottages have to have a fire in them every day, or they will, because of the dampness, they will implode. Even that little cottage I showed you in Inishmaan, that Singh stayed in, it was blazing hot day, blazing, and she had a fire going because yeah. So part of it that is also true. It's also significant that the some of the oppression was built into the economy. There was no manufacturing in Ireland. So Ireland would provide the agriculture to England at a discounted price and have to buy goods from England at an inflated price. So you're right, Tom. I mean, you look around and you say, where's the building? There's not much built here.
Right.
It was all part of that economy. And what we used to call the famine, really, now it's called the Great Hunger, because although there was a potato famine, fish still, swam in the streams, and there was food, but it was all exported to England.
Just bringing something up to date, if I might. The Irish just paid back the Hopi Nation because the Hopi Indians supplied Ireland with food during the famine. And if you read the news articles on that recently, the Irish recently sent a good amount of funding for food to the Hopi Nation in our Western United States. So that was an interesting fact.
Yeah. Same oppressor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. That was good.
Yeah.
Another observation, I guess, is how strongly they held on to the Irish colony versus some of the other colonies like Canada or even India. That it looks like England felt easier to give those colonies up than give up the Irish one. That if for whatever reason they wanted to hold on to that one.
Proximity.
Yeah. Who knows?
I would think a lot of it is proximity.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about it. I mean, some of it is just, look at how protected England is, right? It's the proximity, because their whole coast is protected by the fact of Ireland. One of the reasons she can have such a strong navy. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and of course, the way the partition went down, this provision wasn't honored as we just read it, right? All 32 counties did not become a sovereign nation. She held on to the 6. And I'm sure it has cursed herself every day ever since for having done that. But what's very interesting about this time in Brexit is that, and I just had a speaker come to Hofstra last year from Scotland to talk to us about this. What's very interesting is where that used to be a military border, even in the 90s, it was a military border. And it's a craggy border between the North and the South. So if they couldn't establish a military base with guns, they would just blow up bridges. It was dangerous. Now you wouldn't know that there was a border at all. I've taken students up to the north, and all you notice is that your cell phone changes, and the students will say, "Can we go to an ATM because we need new money?" And it's peaceful, and there's been shared governance and a good peace process. It's been largely successful. These local groups have really been reduced to a bunch of just drug dealers. There's no romance in engaging in all that stuff. But what's happened now with Brexit, one of the unintended consequences is that the only border, well, so there's no such thing as an electoral college, but if you analyze the Brexit vote, the people in the north, in those 6 Northern Ireland and Scotland, voted to stay with Europe. It doesn't matter because they voted as British citizens. It just went to the count. But it's notable, you know, that was their wish. As I explained to my students, it was like the mother left 2 kids in the back seat of the car. She forgot about them, and the names were Scotland and Northern Ireland. And so England went about her business. But this wasn't their will. Now, we all know that Scotland has had a referendum to be independent and lost by a very narrow, like a 1% or less than a 1% margin just recently. If that goes up for referendum again, but she's already expressed that she wants to be part of Europe. So that's not going to go well for England. With Northern Ireland, what is really interesting is now she's the only border between England and Europe is that border across the 6 counties, that hard border. The other border is a natural ocean border. The only land border happens to be the same exact partition. Completely unintended consequence. But now, like I said to you, you just drive past it. It would be just like driving across Hempstead Turnpike. You wouldn't know that you went from one place to the other. And the way that this Scotsman explained it to me, this professor, the best way to understand the consequences of reestablishing a border is the little dairy farmer who is bringing products to market. So he crosses that border 20 times a day, doesn't even know he's crossing it, to get milk here and get eggs here and get butter here. You start putting up a border, it shuts down all of the commerce. Nobody wants it. But most importantly, just like what we saw, the people who brought this nation to bear were the ascendant Protestants in Dublin, the people with power who were allies, we would call them in our country. They understood this had to change. Well, the same people in the north, the Protestants who were part of the governance in the north and part of business, the leaders in the north, they want to be, they don't want any kind of a border or a boundary. If we ever get a united Ireland, it seems all of a sudden it wouldn't be a political thing, it would be economic. And it would be willed by the people who were once in power, which is just an amazing thing. And you know, I hope that would happen. That would be a great thing for everybody. It would mean, you know, peace and prosperity, and who doesn't want that?
Yeah.
So
it would be an economic motivator rather than a political motivator.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I found it interesting that you said that not only were the Irish persecuted, but the Presbyterians as well. I didn't know that.
Also,
my family was Presbyterian, and they were from Londonderry.
Oh, okay. There you go. Yeah, they were persecuted. And if they came to the United States, especially in Maryland, they were persecuted as well and not allowed to run for public office. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Was there any assistance from like Rome or any of the other Catholic nations?
During the famine?
Yeah.
No. Yeah, no, that the Pope was contacted and he was told that this wasn't, you know, it wasn't in their jurisdiction. What happened was there was the invention of the printing press, and word got out to Europeans about what was going on, and to British citizens as well. And they put some pressure on the British government to give some relief. Some of the relief was false relief. Maybe, Tom, when you were in Ireland, you saw something called the famine walls. They told the Irish that they would help them, but they gave them like work farms, or like workhouses, and they would make them do construction, even if it was phony construction. So they would build walls to something that didn't go anywhere, you know, roads that didn't lead anywhere, because they felt that, you know, they needed to earn whatever they they'd been given. So it was a long time for them to get relief, but it did finally begin to happen when Europe was, they were working in a silo. Nobody was paying attention to them. And some of the uglier things that were said at the time by the British government was that this was because the Irish were indolent, and it would be like a genocide. It would be good to to get rid of them anyway. I don't necessarily believe in those kinds of theories that it was a genocide, but there were people, Ian Paisley among them, who felt that this was a good thing, that it had that, if it had that effect.
There are people that feel that way about the virus that's going around now too.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. People have strange opinions sometimes about things.
Yeah.
What was the reasoning for the persecution of the Presbyterians, and were they the only Protestant denomination that was persecuted?
That I know of, it was only the Presbyterians, because the Presbyterians, like the Catholics, would not join what they called the Church of Ireland, which was the Anglican Church, but just in Ireland. And as if you know anything about Presbyterian,
I'm a Presbyterian.
Oh, okay, cool. So Presbyterians believed in having their own relationship with God, as you know.
Right.
Very personal kind of religion. That's the opposite of an empire that seeks to centralize power. Right?
Okay.
And the history of the Anglican Church was the Catholic Church 2.0, because Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce, and so he said, okay, it's about power. It's about yeah.
Right. Do you know if there were Quakers and if they were persecuted also?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, they were.
There are other ones that are very, much apart and personalized relationship with God.
There were not many Quakers in Ireland, but they were persecuted.
Yeah.
Most of them found their way to the new colony, right? They found their way to the United States.
Right, exactly. I had another question too. When you mentioned Trevelyan, the name is familiar to me because of the series Victoria. And I don't know if you watched that, but there was an episode about the Irish famine and his role. Of course, he was an uncaring peer, and the role of Robert Trail, who was a minister. I don't know if you saw that or not.
I've never seen that, but what Trevelyan did was he said, okay, I'll help the Irish. I'll bring in corn from the United States, from North America. The Irish couldn't digest the corn.
Right.
And it made them really sick. Yeah.
Right. And the last thing that I can think of to ask you is, when you were reading the poem about the fields, I was reminded of Sting and his song Fields of Gold.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there was any connection to that.
Not that I know of. I mean, this song is from the 70s, written by an American. So Sting likely knew about the song. And I think about it's also very American, right? Like all the baseball fields of, Paul, what's the fields of?
It's kind of romantic.
Yeah.
It's a romantic ballad.
Yeah, it is.
The fields of barley.
Yeah.
You'll remember me, I remember you.
Yeah. If you listen to the Dropkick Murphys play it, it sounds like a rebel song. Which actually I had here for you, and then I checked it. Field of Dreams, yeah. I had it here for you to listen to, and then it was they pulled it. Sometimes people protest. They get stuff taken off the net, and so that was likely taken off by somebody. What else is interesting too is I'll teach Irish studies in Ireland and study abroad. A lot of the stuff I prepare here, I want to play for my students in Ireland. Besides having really bad Wi-Fi because it's on the Atlantic, we take for granted our First Amendment rights here, but a lot of stuff gets pulled from the net. So there are songs and short film clips and stuff I can show them that aren't available when I take them to Ireland. And part of it is some desire, I think, to keep peace. I mean, for example, on Bastille Day, no, the 12th it is, of July, there's still a big bonfire in Belfast that it must be 50 feet high. And it commemorates the Battle of Boyne, and it's the beginning of the parade season. It's a night of debauchery and violence. At the top of it, they always burn the tricolor, the Irish flag. They often burn the American flag. They burned a figure, an effigy of Barack Obama in the past. It's a very small group of people who hold on to these ideas. But of course, this also comes with poverty and lack of economic opportunity too, right? And that may be one reason why there's some censorship of some of this music and some of these ideas, because it romanticizes, you know, gang, what is really, you know, gang behavior and violence.
I'm going to, for the sake of video, thank Patricia Navarra for the wonderful presentation. I hope you all enjoyed that.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I will be stopping the video, but not the meeting. So continue to do what you're doing. But again, thank you, Patricia, for your expertise and for sharing and for being our first Zoom presenter. And I hope that this set a good precedent that we will be able to continue these meetings. And again, I am now stopping the video.
Okay, thank you.